But today, France is making headlines for something very different. Its national debt. It has reached a record 3.4 trillion euros.
France is broke, not morally. That collapse happened long ago, but financially. The nation that once lectured others on how to run their economies can't even steer its own. Euro 3.4 trillion in debt. Streets on fire with protest. Governments toppling like paper towers. Yet Paris still preaches about fiscal discipline. The irony drips thicker than its debt. The empire that enslaved half the planet in the name of civilization is now shackled by its own greed. France isn't merely falling. It's rotting in public, loud and deserved. But how did it come to this? And what role does Africa play in this unraveling? Let's uncover the truth. There's a strange poetry to downfall, especially when arrogance writes the verses. France, once the self-anointed guardian of global economics, now stands accused before the very rules it created. The figures aren't hidden in dusty financial journals anymore. They're screaming headlines. Euro 3.4 trillion in public debt. That's 115.6% of GDP, almost twice the EU's supposed ceiling of responsibility. Imagine, for a moment, an African finance minister presenting such a budget. The world would shout collapse. But because it's Paris, the narrative softens into economic turbulence. This isn't a number on a spreadsheet. It's a slow-motion implosion 50 years in the making. Since 1973, France hasn't balanced a single budget. Half a century of spending more than it earns, ruling by loans instead of logic. Every president, left, right, or centrist, stacked new credit atop decaying credibility. What once looked like financial sophistication now reeks of polished denial. The first cracks appeared during the pandemic. The treasury burst open, billions poured into relief and healthcare, necessary then, but the tap never turned off. Then the Russian gas crisis of 2022 struck. Terrified of another uprising over energy bills, Paris smothered the problem with subsidies. Billions more disappeared. Emergency spending turned into political addiction, the reflex to drown every crisis in borrowed euros. Now the invoice has arrived. Interest payments alone swallow over 67 billion euros each year, more than the entire education budget. Debt isn't an accounting term anymore. It's a parasite eating the state alive. France borrows to pay its old debts, then borrows again to calm the protests against austerity. This is no longer an economic cycle. It's a cultural one that a nation once known for revolutions now revolts against reality itself. The political fallout has been volcanic. Former Prime Minister François Bayrou attempted to cut 44 billion euros in spending and was buried under strikes. Within weeks, he was gone. His successor, Sébastien Leroux, inherited a government barely able to pass a budget without igniting chaos in Paris, Marseille, and Lyon. Anger thickens the air. Workers furious at inflation, retirees at taxes, youth at hopelessness. That France's problem isn't just reckless management. It's a society refusing to face the cost of comfort bought on credit. And beneath the protests lies a deeper decay, the crumbling illusion of European superiority. For years, France flaunted its debt as proof of modern flexibility, insisting that advanced nations could bear heavier loads. That illusion shattered the moment its credit rating slipped and its bonds began trading with the caution once reserved for the unstable South. Investors now whisper the same words once aimed at Africa: instability, unpredictability, unreliability. The contagion isn't only economic. It's psychological. That a country that believed itself immune to collapse now tastes the same fear it once exported. That France's decline isn't sudden. It's the slow death of a myth. The myth that Europe's systems were guided by reason while Africa's were ruled by emotion. Today, the script has flipped. That Africa's fiscal policies are forged by necessity and reform. France's by panic and denial. The question isn't how much France owes, it's what the debt reveals. Because behind every unpaid bill lies something far deeper than numbers. The moral bankruptcy of an empire that once ruled through money. Strip away the graphs and jargon, and what remains is pure irony. A preacher choking on his own sermon. For decades, Paris dictated economic virtue to the developing world, especially Africa, as if prudence were its divine birthright. That IT wrote the commandments of austerity, privatization, and poverty management. then preached them through the IMF and World Bank as sacred law. But now that those same rules would suffocate its own citizens, France has torn up its gospel. To grasp this hypocrisy, we have to rewind to the 1980s and 1990s, the age of structural adjustment. When African nations faced debt crises back then, they were told the problem wasn't colonial plunder or global trade injustice. No, the fault, said the IMF, often echoing French economists, was overspending. The solution was brutal/social programs, cut fuel subsidies, privatize public assets, and fling open markets to foreign corporations, most of them French. Hospitals were gutted, schools were starved, currencies were devalued into despair. Millions of Africans paid the price for what Paris so smugly called discipline. Fast forward to today, and the roles have grotesquely reversed. France now stands exactly where it once scolded others for standing, buried in overspending, fiscal indiscipline, and dependence on outside lenders. But instead of swallowing the same bitter medicine it forced on Africa, Paris reaches for excuses: wars, pandemics, exceptional European circumstances. When Africa borrowed for power lines and highways, it was branded reckless. When France borrows for welfare and subsidies, it's called strategic stimulus. The dictionary of hypocrisy has never read so clearly. Behind France's arrogance has always lurked fear. The fear of losing moral authority over its former colonies, as long as Africa looked poor. Paris could look principled, as long as African economies were painted as chaotic. France could pose as the voice of order. But now the mirror has cracked. The so-called African debt trap looks tiny beside the mountain Paris built for itself. And unlike Africa, which borrowed to rise, France borrows merely to delay decline. This double standard exposes something deeper than numbers: the psychology of empire. Colonialism never ended. It only changed costume. The new chains were economic: the CFA franc, aid programs, and French-backed loans designed to keep Africa tethered. And when African nations protested, Paris stopped sending soldiers and started sending economists. Control was rebranded as cooperation. Oppression was renamed partnership. That France's financial gospel became a quieter domination. We will teach you how to spend by ensuring you never spend without us. Now, with its own finances imploding, that control is slipping away. African leaders are watching the emperor tremble inside his own palace. The same French technocrats who once drafted austerity plans for Dakar and Abidjan can barely keep their own streets from burning. Protesters in Paris now sound eerily like the Africans France once patronized, angry at foreign dependence, furious at elite corruption, desperate for work, and tired of being told that suffering equals stability. Here's the bitter truth: France hasn't just lost its balance sheet, it's lost its credibility. When you live by double standards, collapse isn't a risk, it's a destiny. For every sermon France ever gave on fiscal responsibility, it forgot one lesson: accountability, and the cost of that arrogance is now public, global, and irreversible. But the story doesn't end here, because France's fall isn't only France's problem. It's Africa's opportunity. If the old master is choking on the rules he once wrote, who now stands ready to write the new ones? The answer doesn't lie in Paris or Brussels. It lies in the capitals long dismissed as dependent: Ouagadougou, Niamey, Bamako, Accra. The question is no longer whether Africa can lead, it's whether the world is ready to admit that it already is. France's economic decay isn't just a European headline. It's the mirror Africa needed to stop doubting itself. For decades, the continent was told to copy Europe's model of governance and finance. Follow the West, they said, and you'll prosper. But what happens when the West loses its own map? When the self-proclaimed teacher forgets its lessons, the students stop listening, and Africa finally has. This moment, right here, right now, marks a quiet revolution in global economics. Across the continent, nations are shifting from dependency to design, creating systems that serve their people, not foreign approval. The same Africa that once queued at IMF doors now builds its own alternatives. The BRICS New Development Bank, the African Export-Import Bank, Afreximbank, and the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, PAPSS. Institutions built to break the Western monopoly on credit and trade. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré embodies that defiance. When Western powers demanded reforms in exchange for loans. He said no, choosing to build with gold, not debt. His government redirected mining revenue into food production and industrial growth. Once written off as one of the world's poorest nations, Burkina Faso now supplies grain to its neighbors. Charest logic is simple yet revolutionary. A nation that eats from its own soil will never beg. In Niger, the rejection of French control over uranium wasn't merely political defiance. It was a financial declaration of independence. For decades, Paris paid scraps for the uranium that powered its nuclear plants while Nigerian towns sat in darkness. But after the Sahel military alliance took shape, Niger began renegotiating its contracts with a confidence Africa hadn't witnessed in half a century. The message was unmistakable. The age of extraction is over. The age of negotiation has begun. And then there is Mozambique, where President Daniel Chapo has pushed forward massive industrial projects without surrendering a single inch of sovereignty. The Mfanda Nkuwa hydropower project, valued at $6 billion, isn't being financed by Western lenders, but through multi-nation African partnerships that keep regional interests at the center. The focus has shifted, not toward aid, but toward agency. That transformation, subtle yet seismic, separates this era from every one before it. Even in nations like Ghana, Rwanda, and Kenya, the mindset is changing. Financial literacy and domestic investment are no longer academic ideas. They've become political movements. Young Africans aren't asking how to borrow anymore. They're asking how to own. The generation raised on the myth that Europe knows best is now watching Europe's own house burn and realizing we were never the problem. This reversal of influence, from Paris to Pan-African, is more than economic. It's psychological. Francis. Collapse has shattered the myth of Western invincibility. The empire that built its wealth on Africa's back can no longer balance its own books, while the continent it mocked as undisciplined now practices the restraint and innovation the West abandoned. But this transformation didn't happen by chance. It happened through awakening. African nations learned by observation what textbooks refused to teach. Debt is not development. Dependency is not partnership. Lectures are not leadership. The same crisis now shaking Europe has become Africa's mirror of self-clarity. Yet, even as Africa rises, much of the world pretends not to see it. Western media downplays the shift, calling it regional assertiveness or temporary populism. But what's unfolding is far deeper. It's the redefinition of global competence. The student has outgrown the teacher. Still, one question lingers. If Africa has finally stopped listening to its old masters, how will it rewrite the narrative that chained it for so long? Because rejecting hypocrisy is one thing. Replacing it with a new standard is another. When the teacher fails and the student takes the chalk, the first thing to change is the definition of success. For decades, the West defined stability in economic terms that served its image: balanced budgets, low inflation, narrow deficits, while ignoring the deeper truths of justice and sustainability. Africa was always judged by those sterile Western metrics, as though a number on a spreadsheet mattered more than a full stomach or a working power grid. But as France's crisis drags Europe into uncertainty, that illusion of Western stability is collapsing. And Africa is quietly rewriting what stability truly means. The turning point came when African governments began questioning rules that were never written in their favor. For years, European economists preached that a good economy was one attracting foreign investors, not one empowering its own producers. That logic forged nations that exported raw materials and imported everything else. Now, from Dar es Salaam to Dakar, policymakers are flipping the formula. True stability, they argue, isn't measured by foreign credit ratings, but by the strength of domestic production. Take Ghana, for instance. Once crushed under IMF loan conditions, it's now building value chains in mining and agriculture. Ghana no longer exports only gold. It refines IT no longer just sells cocoa. It's investing in chocolate manufacturing for local and regional markets. These aren't minor economic decisions. They are acts of liberation. The country's new financial doctrine is based on self-containment, not Western approval. Rwanda, too, offers a fresh definition of order. Its economy isn't fueled by borrowing or resource dependency, but by governance and efficiency. Kigali's focus on digital infrastructure, public accountability, and industrial parks has made it one of Africa's most stable states, and it did so without French aid or European supervision. Unlike Europe, where citizens revolt against reform, Rwandans are active participants in transformation. Here, stability isn't passive, it's participatory. Even Kenya has redrawn the meaning of fiscal health. When Western analysts mocked Nairobi's public debt, Kenyan planners answered with proof. Those loans are tied to visible projects, ports, expressways, data centers, not invisible bureaucracies. Kenya borrows to expand, not to consume. Contrast that with France, whose €3.4 trillion debt feeds pensions, subsidies, and political promises that create no growth. It's the difference between debt that builds and debt that buries. And this is where the global conversation is shifting. The same Western powers that once used credit agencies and economic forums as weapons of judgment now find themselves under the microscope. When Fitch Ratings downgraded France, African observers saw poetic symmetry, the colonial grader being graded for the first time. The myth of Western superiority is being audited by its own failures. But Africa's quiet revolution runs deeper than policy. It's philosophical. The continent is redefining stability, not as austerity, but as adaptability. In an age of pandemics, climate shocks, and shifting alliances, the nations that survive aren't those with pristine balance sheets, but those that can pivot without collapse. Africa, forged through crisis after crisis, has become the world's laboratory of resilience. Whether it's Nigeria's fintech boom, Ethiopia's manufacturing surge, or Senegal's energy independence drive, African stability now rests on flexibility, something rigid European bureaucracies can no longer imitate. Meanwhile, France's paralysis exposes the curse of comfort. Europe built systems so centralized, so bureaucratic, that they can no longer evolve without breaking. Africa, by contrast, was built out of necessity, decentralized, experimental, sometimes chaotic, yet alive. Where Paris debates austerity, Lagos builds startups. Where Brussels argues over reforms, Kigali implements them before breakfast. The contrast can no longer be ignored. And still, the global media insists on old cliches: emerging, volatile, unpredictable. But look closer. Volatility is just another word for vitality. Africa's volatility births innovation. Europe's rigidity breeds stagnation. This is no longer a contest of continents. It's a clash of philosophies the old world worships stability even as it decays. The New World embraces movement as strength. France's unraveling economy proves that static order is only collapse in slow motion. Africa's rise shows that disorder, when guided by vision, becomes evolution. Change the definition of stability, and the world eventually notices. What began as Africa's quiet correction has become the planet's loudest reality check. France's economic implosion hasn't just exposed one nation's weakness. It's unmasked an entire system built on illusion. The Western economic model, the same one forced upon Africa, is now crumbling in its own backyard. And Africa, for the first time in centuries, is watching without flinching. This reckoning isn't only financial. It's civilizational. Europe's strength once came from extracting Africa's wealth and then lecturing Africa on productivity. That cycle is broken. The mines once controlled by outsiders are being reclaimed. The currencies they printed are being replaced. The rules they wrote are being rewritten. And this time, Africa holds the PEN.AS Paris scrambles to plug a €3.4 trillion deficit. The same continent it once called underdeveloped is investing in sovereign gold refineries, cross-border payment systems, and regional industrial networks. Africa no longer imitates, it replaces. The shift in mindset is historic. For centuries, Africa's strategy was reactionary, forever responding to IMF reforms, sanctions, and external pressure. Today, it's proactive. Instead of waiting for aid, nations are building intra-African economies that shield them from foreign debt. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, is no longer a signature on paper. It's becoming a shield. It gives Africa what Europe lost: control of its own market. African resources, African labor, and African innovation now circulate within Africa before enriching anyone else. This transformation is shaking the old powers to their core. Western economists trained to view Africa through dependency now find themselves out of arguments. They can't call Africa unstable when France flirts with recession. They can't cry corruption when their own parliaments drown in scandal. They can't warn of debt traps while their nations live on. Credit, the hypocrisy that once fed their authority has burned out, and with it, their credibility. Yet Africa's rise is not driven by vengeance. It's driven by vision. Its leaders don't seek to replace Europe as a new empire. They seek to end empire altogether. From Burkina Faso's Sahel alliance to Ethiopia's infrastructure diplomacy, the new African order is founded on cooperation, not coercion. It's not about who rules. It's about who builds. That's why the West's panic feels misplaced. Africa's goal isn't domination, it's independence. Still, the irony is impossible to miss as France begs Brussels for fiscal leniency. African nations once told to tighten their belts are now lending to global markets as the euro trembles under debt. African currencies once chained to it through the CFA franc are being reconsidered for full sovereignty. What was once dismissed as impossible is now inevitable. The so-called dark continent is no longer a metaphor for despair. It's the silhouette of the future rising behind a fading empire. The world is beginning to pivot toward this new center of gravity. Russia, China, Turkey, and India have already recognized it. Even Latin America and Southeast Asia are mirroring Africa's strategy, asserting local control over resources, rejecting austerity, demanding fair trade. Africa has become the blueprint for post-colonial resilience, proof that endurance, when forged in fire, becomes strength. And as Europe clings to nostalgia, Africa embraces necessity, the same necessity that helped it survive colonization, resist manipulation, and now rise in unison. France's crisis, in that sense, isn't just a fall. It's a mirrored. It reflects the arrogance of a world that believed dominance was eternal and dependency was Africa's destiny. But this time, the narrative flips. When the lights dim in Paris, they flicker on in Ouagadougou. When the euro trembles, the African Union stands taller. The torch is moving, silently, but surely, from the hands of those who borrowed their power to those who earned it. And as history turns its page, one truth stands unshakable. Africa was never behind. The world was simply looking in the wrong direction. Do you still believe the West is the model the world should follow? Let us know in the comments that if France can drown in its own debt, who truly deserves to be called developing? Want more stories like this one? Subscribe and tap the bell icon to join us as we uncover the untold Black culture, civilization, history, and the undeniable evidence of how glorious we have always been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.